Okay, good morning. Let's begin. We're on 119b, Zevachim, um, 5 lines up from the first net from where the lines get wider. Mechitza b'damim. So um, mechitza b'damim. Let's have to make sure I'm. Yes, okay. Mechitza b'damim. There's a mechitza, that's the line in the middle of Mizbeach. There was a horizontal line that divided the upper part from the lower part, which was relevant for where the blood should be sprinkled, above or below the line. Um, so that was only needed on a Bama Gedola, on the public Mizbeach. The proof text is Vaisah Rashas ad Chatzi HaMizbeach. The Gemara doesn't explain here that ad Chatzi HaMizbeach, it's the Mizbeach, so only the specific Mizbeach, the public Mizbeach, not Bama Ketana, not private Mizbeach, that had this Rashas, that had this net that only came up halfway. Richutz Yadayim, and the needing to wash your hands and feet, presumably before the avoda, is also only required for Bama Gedola, for a public Mizbeach. And again, it's HaMizbeach, the specific Mizbeach, the public Mizbeach. So this the requirement, these requirements for the mechisa, the line, that's only for the kachim of a private mizbeach. But kadshe bama katana, the something that was sanctified by the private mizbeach, the krivim b'bama katana, and you also did the actual sacrifice on the private mizbeach. But if you made it kodesh, if you sanctified it with the intention of doing a private mizbeach, and then you decided, no, I'm going to go to Shiloh or Yerushalayim or wherever and do it on the public mizbeach, yesh chitzui, then it does require, which makes sense, right? Because where you're actually doing the avoda is where that mizbeach has the line, and so you should. Then it needs to have a line. Mostly Rav asked. On this Chazav V'Shok, there's a brayso that says Chazav V'Shok U'Trumas Lachmei Toda, the requirement to raise and lower, like to wave the breast and the thigh of the shlamim, and the raising of the bread that came with the toda. Those apply only to the kachim of a public mizbeach and not a private mizbeach. So we're going to infer from this that it doesn't apply to a private mizbeach that you made it kodesh there, even if the actual sacrifice was done on the public mizbeach. So Gemara says, no, don't read it that way. Ema nogin b'bama gedola ve'en nogin b'bama ketana. If you read it that way, then it means it applies to a public mizbeach, even if the thing was made kodesh for the private mizbeach, but doesn't apply to a bama ketana at all. Okay, so then that makes it come out the same way as our other brayso. Or some read it like this. The requirement for the mechitza is only if everything is done on the public mizbeach, that it was made kodesh for the public mizbeach, and it was actually done on the public mizbeach. But if you made it kodesh for a small mizbeach, for a private mizbeach, and then you ended up bringing it to a public mizbeach, then it doesn't require the mechitza, the line. So that if you read it if that's the original statement, then lema messiah. So maybe this other brayso we just brought would be a support, which is chazav v'shok U'Trumas Lachmei Toda nogin b'kodesh bama gedola ve'ein nogin b'kodesh bama ketana. So we're going to read it the same way. So the Gemara says, no, read it the way we said before. Nogin bama gedola ve'ein nogin bama ketana. It applies to a public mizbeach. In other words, if you did everything on the public mizbeach, then it applies, but it doesn't apply to when you did the when you started it on a private mizbeach, um, and it applies even if you started it on a private mizbeach, but it doesn't apply if everything is on the private mizbeach. um, Upligad Rebbe Lazar, and this opposes Rebbe Lazar. Rebbe Lazar, olas bamas yachid shechnisa bifnim. If you have an ola of a private mizbeach and you brought it in, and then in other words you were intending to do it on the private mizbeach, and then you brought it to the public mizbeach. You didn't even put it on the mizbeach yet, but you brought it into the space of into the partition of the public mizbeach, which would be like the Azara in Yerushalayim. Kaltua machitzos l'chol davar. Then the public mizbeach kind of acquires it, or it's now in the domain of a public mizbeach, and all the rules of a public mizbeach apply to it. By Reb Zera, or Reb Zera asked about that. Olas bomas yachid shechnisa lifnim v'otzia l'chutz ma'u. What about an ola of a private mizbeach, and then you brought it to inside to the public mizbeach, and then you took it back out? Okay, now what's the deal? Miamri kevan da'ilo koltola mechitzta. Once it came into the public mizbeach space, so then it becomes required to do everything like the public, like a public sacrifice. Oh, Dilma kevan da'adar. Maybe as long as it's in there, then you have to do it like a public mizbeach. But then if you took it out again, it was still a private mizbeach ola. So maybe that's maybe the new rules don't apply. So the Gemara says, wait, find the Plukta Rabba Rav Yosef. We had this argument already. It's not. We've Mishnah. Kacha kashim sheshachton b'daram, mo'alim b'hem, v'imolu le'erdu. If you have kachim that you did the shchita, the slaughtering in the south, which is the wrong place. It's supposed to be in the north for kachim, and so they become pasul. So if you use them for yourself, then it's me'ilah still applies. It still belongs to the temple in the sense that if you use it for personal use, then that's an offense. That's a lav. And if they but now, so once you did the shechita in the wrong place, it shouldn't go up on the mizbeach. But if you did take it up on the mizbeach, don't take it down. In other words, you actually do burn it on the mizbeach. And they asked about that. Yardu Moshialu. What? Okay, so you took it up to the mizbeach. You weren't supposed to, and then you mistakenly brought it back down. Right. So now what's the din? So now this is kind of similar to our case, right? Our case is you brought it into the mechitza, even though it wasn't, and then you took it back out. So what rule applies? The fact that it was already inside, does the public mizbeach rule apply to it? Or the fact that you took it back out, does it now revert to the private mizbeach rules? So similar kind of thing here that the Gemara is trying to say. The Gemara says this is the same inquiry. Yardu Moshialu. It wasn't supposed to go up to the Mizbeach, but it did go up, and now you took it back down. So now what rule applies? Do you take it back up and burn it or not? Rabba Amar Le'yalu, or Yosef Amar Yalu. So that's the machlokas. Rabba says, no, it's once you've taken it down, leave it down because it's pasul. And Rav Yosef says, no, even though it's pasul, once it got on the Mizbeach, you have to keep it on the Mizbeach, and if you took it off, you have to bring it back. So isn't it the same question? Tibai Rabba, Tibai Rav Yosef. No, we're going to say our case of bringing the private sacrifice inside the walls or the domain of the public mizbeach is a different case, either Rabba or Rav Yosef. You can't necessarily apply the rule of bringing up the pasul carbon to the mizbeach and taking it back down. Why? Tibai Rabba, Ankan Lon Kama Rabba, El Mizbeach, the Chazile, Mekadesh, Lo Mekadesh. According to Rabba, maybe that what he's saying about the Mizbeach, Rabba said, Lo Yalu. No, if you've taken it down again, don't bring it back up. Why? Because maybe that applies because it's possible. It wasn't really for the Mizbeach. Okay, once it's on the Mizbeach will consume everything that's there. But if you took it back down again, it wasn't something that the Mizbeach could really acquire. for itself. So if you've taken it down, then leave it down. Amo machitza, but the case is our case where you're bringing the private sacrifice into the public thing. Um, Even though um, uh, that's not his proper place, you wanted to do it on a private mizbeach. Nonetheless, it's it worked. Like the public mizbeach acquires it, so that all the rules should apply. Odilma filu Rabbi Yosef. One second. Odilma, or maybe you can say, even according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, Ad kan lo kama Rabbi Yosef hasam elodechad makom hu. Rabbi Yosef was talking about the possible carbon that went up on the Mizbeach. It's all in the same space. Everything's occurring within the Azara, right? Mistakes were made, but it's all in the same place. So maybe that's why the Mizbeach gets to keep it, as it were. Avol hacha, but in our case of the private-public thing, the tremakomos nihu, they're talking about two separate spaces. Like maybe the public mizbeach doesn't really exercise full domain, full control over the private sacrifice because it's a completely different space. Or maybe that isn't a distinction. Teku. So in other words, you can't apply the rules of the apostle carbon going up and down the mizbeach to the case of the private carbon going in and out of the space of the public mizbeach. They could have the same rule, they could have different rules. That's why the question is raised separately. Now, Milsa de Pshita L'Rabba B'chad Gisa L'Rav Yosef B'chad Gisa. Now, this, Rabba and Rabbi Yosef had their strong opinions about what to do with the apostle carbon that went up and down the mizbeach. Rabbi Yanai wasn't so sure about this. The Rabbi Yanai, Avari Olas Bamas Yachid, the limbs of an Ola, of a private mizbeach, Sha'olu mizbeach, Viardu, and they went up on I think this means on the public mizbeach, and then they came down. Mao. What's the halacha? Do you take it back up? Was it really acquired by the mizbeach? I'm not even asking about when it hadn't been burned yet, like the fire hadn't caught yet on these limbs. Those certainly don't go up again. But but if the fire did catch, then what's the halacha? So teku. So Rabbi Yanai doesn't know. Itmar, we said before. Shlita slayla b'mamas yachid. Now you're not supposed to do shchita at night. It's only a daytime activity. And that rule is stated about the public mizbeach. What about private mizbeach? Can you do shchita at night? Rav Shmuel. So we have machlokas Rav and Shmuel. One says it's okay to do it at night, and one says no. But and what they're arguing about is the statement of Rav Elazar. Rav Elazar Rame, Krayadadi. Rav Elazar, asked about a contradictory psukim. So there was a case where this is in Shmuel. Shaul had a war with the Plishtim, and afterwards the people behaved incorrectly. They captured all this booty. They had cattle, sheep, whatever, and they ate it without proper shchita and without draining the blood. So Shaul says to them, "Vayomer, begadim, you're traitorous. Like you've done the wrong thing here." He said, "Bring a big stone, roll a big stone over to me." He was going to use it as a mizbeach, and obviously it's a private mizbeach. And it says "Golo hayom," today. So the Gemara is inferring in the daytime, implying that wouldn't work at night. Can't do shchita at night. Uksiv, but there's another pasuk says Vayomer Shaul in the continuing account of this story. Shaul says, "Putzu ba'am, spread out among the people, v'amartim lam, and say to them, Hagishu elai ish shor of ish sehu." Everybody bring, don't stop slaughtering, stop eating the cattle and the sheep without shchita. Bring it here to this mizbeach that I've made. Ushchat tempozen, shet it here. And then you can eat it. And don't sin to God by eating it without shechita. And and this source is very clear, right? They brought them there at night, and they did the shechita, and they did the shechita. So this part of the story implies that you can do shechita at night. So Marmashani Kamechul and Kamechukachim. One answers, oh, okay, you can't do shechita at night. That only applies to kachim. That only applies to sacrificial things. But just regular shechita to shecht an animal to make it kosher, that you can do at night. Well, Marmashani, but the other one answers, Kamechukachim Bamagadol, Kamechukachim Bamagatana. I said, no. It's not that it's you can even make a looser rule. The only daytime requirement is for a public mizbech, but this wasn't even a public mizbech. This was a private mizbech. I think it means not only regular shechita can be done at night, but even shechita's kachim for a private mizbech can be done at night. Itmar olas bamas yachid, the ola of a private mizbech. Rav Amar ein tu nahafshet v'nituach. It doesn't require being skinned and cut up into pieces. Rabbi Yochanan Amar tu nahafshet v'nituach. No, Rabbi Yochanan says it's just like the public mizbech, the carbon, the ola requires to be skinned and cut up. They argue with Rabbi Yossi Glili, the Tanya Rabbi Yossi Glili Omer, Ola Shikrivi Yisrael Bamidbar ain't tu nahashev v'nituach. He says, you know what? When the people did an ola in the Mishkan, in the desert, it didn't need skinning and coming up. No, that rule only applied once the Ohel Moed was established. In other words, once a public mizmech was established, then you have to start doing by the public mizmech rules. But before that, everything was considered a private mizmech and did not require skinning and cutting up. So one holds, Rabbi Yochanan holds, that once the Ohel Moed was established, once the public mizbech was established, then the rule of hafshet v'nituach applies to all mizbech, even the private mizbech. But the other Rav says, no, once the Ohel Moed was established, yes, in the public mizbech you had to do hafshet v'nituach, but that rule never applied to the private mizbech. We have a proof for Rabbi Yochanan. Here's the brisa.
What is the order of? Now, wait a second. But aren't they eating the if they're making cut like a kachim kalim for?
Well, we're talking about an ola.
That's what I was going to ask you. Are we talking only about an ola? Because then not to skin it. Now I'm thinking if you're eating it, you got to skin it, right? So that's I was going to ask, are we only talking about an ola?
Yes. It says the source here said ola, right? And
I missed
that's
that.
the only one that requires. Oh, sorry. That's the only. I believe that's the only carbon that requires. Maybe you need to skin it to eat it, as you say, but that may be more of a practical thing. So we have a support for Rabbi Yochanan. The Brisa says, what is the difference in halacha between the public and the private mizbeach? Here they are. Karen, you have to have the public mizbeach requires a karen, the raised corner, v'kevesh and a ramp, v'yasod and a base, and v'ribua, it has to be square. Those requirements all apply to a public mizbeach. They don't apply to a small, private mizbeach. That can just be like Shaul, just a big rock. Kiyar v'kano b'bama gedola, and also the basin and the pitcher for the basin and the base of it. Required for the public mizbeach, not required for the private mizbeach. Chaz v'shok, the raising and waving of the breast and the thigh of the shlamim, that applies only to a public mizbeach, not to a private mizbeach. In what ways are they the same? Shchita, uktana. You have to do shchita. right? I mean, this seems kind of obvious, but the Gemara is stating, yes, doesn't matter. Private mizbeach, public mizbeach, it requires shchita. Havshei v'nituach b'gedola k'tana, and for an ola, the skinning and cutting up was required for both. Dam matir umefagel b'gedola k'tana. These are three things. Dam, you have to sprinkle the blood, and not matir, but I think this is masir, right? Like nosar. 1 second.
The matir.
No, you're right. I was right the first time. Dam matir, that the meat can be eaten once you do the zrikas adam, and umafagel, and the rules of pigul apply, b'gedola k'tana, for both. Mumin uzman, and whether that the animal can't have a mum, a blemish, and that there's a certain time period in which you can eat it. B'gedola k'tana also apply to both. Avol nosar v'hazman v'hatame shavin zebozeh. Not nosar here, it means that not that there is a time period, but that you have to burn whatever's left over after the time period, the hazman, and this is similar to pigul, that thinking that you're going to do it outside of its time, the hatame, and doing it betuma shavin zebozeh, that applies both to public and private mizbeach.
Well, wouldn't it say the notar, if it leaves it over too far, is subject to the karet? Isn't that true also? I mean, if it eats it beyond that time?
Presumably,
isn't that the concept of notar? You can
eat
up to a certain point.
So it applies to both bama gadol and bama katana. Right? That's what we're saying here, that it applies to both. Tana Rabbanan. Minayin lasos zman b'bama katana b'bama gadola. How do you know, what's the source that leaving that, there's a time period, a valid time period, applies to both public and private? Amar Torah lan yisaref. The Torah says that anything that was if you leave it over, it has to be burned. And upigul yisaref, and the Torah says that pigul has to be burned. Ma pigul pasal babama, af lan pasal babama. So pigul, we know, is pasal if it's even on a private mizbeach. So too, the nosar is private mizbeach. It applies also to private mizbeach.
How are they connecting that? Is it a gezerah shav? How are they connecting the two?
Hekesh, I guess you would call it, right? That they both, since they're equivalent in one rule, we figure they must be equivalent in the other rule. Or maybe not. The Amar Torah, lan yisaref, v'yotze yisaref. Because the Torah also says that something that's left over has to be burnt, and something that the third case, that something that leaves the proper place, leaves the azara, has to be burned. My yotze kasher babama, aflan kasher babama. But yotze, there's no rule of leaving. There's no mechitza. There's no domain around a private mizbeach, so yotze doesn't apply. So maybe. And yotze still gets burned if it's a public mizbeach. Maybe that should apply to lina, right? To something that's left over. V'lav kol. 1 second.
Well, but there's no yotze with a private mizbeach, though, right?
Exactly, right. So you want to say that we should apply the rule of pigul to nosar, but maybe not. Maybe we should apply the rule of yotze to nosar. And yotze, there is no. It doesn't apply to private mizbeach, so maybe we should say about nosar that doesn't apply to a private mizbeach, right? Like, which one do you get the rule from? Do you get it from pigul, which does apply to a private mizbeach, or do you get it from yotze, which doesn't apply to private mizbeach? Which one should you apply to nosar?
And we're learning this from a hekesh between the two of me. What is?
Yeah, the hekesh is that the rule is that all these things get burnt, right? Pigul, lan, and yotze, they all get, if the rule applies to them, then they have to be burnt.
Right.
Okay, so now the question is, well, what about, now, does that apply to do we say that this applies to a private mizbeach? If we derive lan from pigul, well, pigul applies to a private mizbeach, so lan also should apply to a private mizbeach. But if we derive the rule from yotze, yotze does not apply to a private mizbeach, so don't apply that to lan. So the Gemara says,
Are
well, wait.
all three of them connected, or would we say that Yotze
No, we
and
know.
Pigul would be connected by a hekesh?
Yes, so we know the rule for pigul. Apparently, I'm not sure exactly why we know this. Okay, but we know the Gemara is stating we know both things about pigul. We know that it gets burned, and we know that it applies to both public and private mizbeach. We also know both rules about yotze. We know that yotze gets burned, and we know that yotze does not apply to a private mizbeach. Now, lan we know gets burnt, but we don't know. Does it apply for a private mizbeach or not? Do we apply the rule of pigul, which does apply to a private mizbeach? Do we apply that private mizbeach rule to lan, or do we apply the yotze rule? The yotze rule is it doesn't apply to a private mizbeach. Do we apply that to lan? Okay. So how do we resolve this? Gemara says, "V'lav kol chomer hu mi'ofos." You know what? Figure it out from birds, from a bird a bird korban. Ma ofos she'en hamum posel bahen zman posel bahem. Birds don't have. There's not a requirement for mooming, right? Like there is no moom for a bird. So, and nonetheless, even though they're not so clearly, they're not so, we're not that particular about birds, but still there's time requirement, right? There is a time period in which you can eat the bird. So possible in kache bama, and yet what we know about birds is, one second.
There's no mumrat regarding a bird, right?
But now think about the kachim of a private mizbeach. Mum applies. I mean, not if it's a bird, but if it's an animal, mum applies. And so certainly, like if even a bird, which mum doesn't even apply, but it still has a time period. So animals of a bama katana, animals of a private mizbeach, where mum does apply. So you see, we are fairly particular, more particular about that than a bird. So we should certainly also say that you have to keep it within that the time period does apply. So Gemara says, well, wait a minute. Mala ofos shekainin azar kasher and tell me bama katana shazar kasher. You want to tell me that birds is not so particular? We're very particular about birds because it has to be done by a Kohen, right? Now, Bama Katana doesn't have to be done by a Kohen, so that's where we're not so particular. Lo yezman possible. So maybe if we're not so particular about private mizbeach, then we're not so particular about the time period. Talmud Lomar, this is all resolved by the Torah. Fizos Torah Zevach Hashlamim. This is the rule of Zevach Shlamim. Lasso Zman Bama Katana Kezman Bama Gedola. Like it's saying, there is some general rule about Zevach Shlamim, whether it's public or private mizbeach, the same rule applies. And what are we going to say that about? We're going to say that about that it applies to both. We're going to say that about the
notar.
About notar. Yes, thank you. About leaving it up.
So this is it becomes a gezeret katuv. Zot Torah zevach.
Exactly. So all of those back and forth and trying to figure out, we're going to resolve by saying, you know what, the Torah told us, and so that's the rule. We're very pleased that we've finished Zevachim, and tomorrow we will begin Menachos. See you all there.
So that the idea of that the bird doesn't have a mum, does it? Now, someone once said to me, I remember a Rava, I was learning that that the whole idea of when we talk about a mum, that the animal, a behema, can be considered, if you find a mum, it's not glat. For instance, a mum in the lung, if it's a bleb, and so forth. So he said when people would ask, he'd be on an airplane and someone would say, I want the glat kosher chicken. And to himself, he would laugh because there is no such thing as a glatt kosher chicken. It's either
Right.
kosher or not kosher. So to say that, to think that it would be glatt kosher because it's absent of mum, he says this person is an amaretz.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Okay. Have a good day, everybody.
Okay.